Much better this time, Tommy.
Is it really?
Yeah, much better feed. Much better feed.
You're sounding a lot better too.
Yep. Okay, guys, we're very sorry, but here's Tommy Skarlis. We're a little bit delayed, but Tommy, take it over. Run with it. I'm shutting my video off, leaving you alone, letting you do this. Thank you, folks. And Tommy, it's all yours.
You know what? We're not sorry. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, everybody. Glad to have you here tonight. Thanks for being patient. Really fired up right now. AIM Weekend Walleye Series is off to a bang. And in the concept of this seminar, webinar, what we wanted to do was we wanted to talk about hot walleye tactics. And we also came together with this idea for the AIM Tournament Trail. Now, I fish the Minnesota AIM WWS, which is the Weekend Walleye Series. But these tactics can also be used on other bodies of water. And what I mean by that is, as we roll across this, we'll talk a little bit about Big Stone Lake. 1996, it was my first victory. Chad Kincaid and I won a Masters Walleye Circuit there. In 97, we anchored the Team of the Year there, which you can see in the photo here. And now rolling 20 years later, believe it or not, kind of dates me a little bit. I was 12, by the way, when I won that tournament. 20 years later, we've got an AIM showing up there. Now, these are also deadly tactics that can be used on, say, like the Winnebago system. And what I'm going to be talking about is casting shorelines or fishing for shoreline fish. Now, when you take predator position, and this is an image courtesy of In-Fisherman, you've got zone turbulence from an in-blowing wind. This is crashing waves against the shore. Bait gets pushed against the shore, and then in turn is that bait is fed upon or preyed upon by walleyes. And when you look at this, these walleyes are going to hold off of this structure, and they're going to eat those prey fish. You can also count on this bite in a post situation or a post-wind situation. In other words, fishing the leftover wind on a situation like this. So if the wind's blowing into a western shoreline on Tuesday and you're going to fish there on Wednesday and the wind's blowing out of a different direction, realize that there's still going to be leftover bait. Now, when it comes to Big Stone, and you can see over here down in this lower right corner that there is a 1 mile scale. So you start adding all the shoreline in that's on this system right here. And in turn, as you can see a ton of shoreline in this situation. When I'm casting shoreline, I'm going to cover water fast. I think a lot of anglers make the mistake that they've got their trolling motor on 1 or 2 or 3, or they're letting the wind just bump them along slowly, and they're making a cast every 3-4 feet. I think 20 feet is minimum as far as the amount of distance between casts. Make sure that you start lopping it up there, move another 20 feet, lop it up there. Then if you catch fish, then slowly turn around and then work that area over slowly and cast that more methodically when you get back to that area there. And when I'm working this, there's going to be some challenges for the modern day anglers. In other words, what's going to take Big Stone is one of the bodies of water, among others, that there's cleaner water than ever before. Another issue that we're going to have now, because there's cleaner water, because sun penetrates deeper, photosynthesis occurs, we've got a lot more weeds growing up. So that's also going to be, a challenge to fish the weeds, work through the weeds, cast into the weeds. And then now we've also going to add in one more monkey wrench to the equation, which is fish that are more educated. These fish are more pressured. These fish are feeling, and seeing more baits. On any given day, on a lot of the bodies of water like the Mississippi River that I fish, you're seeing more and more anglers that are showing the fish a lot more baits. So, first, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to fish areas or places where a lot of anglers aren't fishing. If you go to a long stretch of weeds, there's going to be a lot of anglers that are going to avoid the weeds. They don't want to continually take clean fouled lures. They're going to want to fish easier. So, the road less traveled, the dirt road, oftentimes is going to have a lot more fish and a lot less anglers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tools that I've got at hand. I've actually got an AquaView micro camera that I hook up to my electronics that I can see down into the weeds. I'm going to use side vision, down vision to look into the weeds, look into the structure, and find fish that a lot of other anglers aren't going to find. Then I'm going to go after these fish with non-traditional approaches. Now, this is something that's been covered. I don't think we've covered it enough, but worked with Matt Straw on fairy wands and sissy cranks, which was in the 2015 In Fisherman Walleye Guide. And you can still, go back through your old walleye guides. Of course, I save all of my walleye guides, all of my walleye insiders, any walleye article that's been an In Fisherman. I've got the entire collection, and I revert back to these reference sources quite often. The same thing is true right now with the internet. I mean, you can actually search this. This is a current article that's up and kind of been a little bit reworked, which is small crankbaits for walleyes. And up here at the top of the page is actually going to be the address for that. So if you want to follow that address and read this article, this is going to help you understand this system a little bit better. Now, let's talk about sissy cranks, and let's talk about fairy wands. First of all, sissy cranks are little tiny crankbaits. And, why don't walleyes see very many sissy cranks? That's because most anglers don't own them. A lot of anglers have bigger crankbaits, reef runners, shad wraps, bigger flicker shads, you name it, and they don't have a lot of these smaller, tinier crankbaits. I've fished with small crankbaits for years. A lot of times in a cold front, or you get into a pressurized situation where the fish are feeling the pressure, little crankbaits actually can save the day. Most anglers don't throw them. And the reason why is a lot of times they're chunking bigger baits like bombers, bandits, DT10s, 16s, stuff that you can really whip out there, not only with a spinning rod, but there's even some walleye anglers that are pretty adept to casting bait casters. And then I think the last one is macho. The go big or go home, bigger baits catch bigger fish. What are we going to use those little crankbaits for? And it becomes a systematically a macho thing. Where when we're talking sissy cranks, we already own a lot of these. Of course, the Salmo Hornet's been called the king of the slots on Mille Lacs, and even number 3 Hornets, which are smaller than these. But here's a lot of the baits, and you can see there's a lot of really cool colors. Number 4 and number 5 flicker shads, and I'm actually even getting more and more into the number 4 flicker shads that are actually these smaller crankbaits that, again, fish aren't going to see a lot. The other reason I think a lot of anglers don't throw small crankbaits is they're hard to get out there. They're hard to cast these smaller crankbaits. Now, going to a thinner diameter line is going to help you out quite a bit, but I've gone back to monofilament for a lot of my fishing, both trolling and especially casting crankbaits. Learn this lesson on Devil's Lake. Throw a lot of crankbaits on Devil's Lake, throw a lot of small crankbaits. A few years ago, quite a number of years ago, it was shad wraps. Now with the Northerns, I prefer a non-rattling bait on Devil's Lake. That's where the number 4, number 3 Salmo Hornets really come in handy. The reason I like the non-rattling baits is the snot rockets or the northern pike are going to come after those rattling baits, and I can stay away from them if I can keep the commotion down. Now, of course, you start catching walleyes, snot rockets move in, but monofilament is a great line to use, in my opinion, due to the fact that it stretches. I had a tournament on Devil's Lake. That's where I learned this lesson, to where I lost 3 or 4 really good fish. Good buddy of mine, John Kalinsky, told me, hey man, you got to switch back to monofilament. I know that you're going to lose a few more baits to the trees and to the Northerns, but monofilament stretches a little bit. And that's again why I feel it's really vital to use a monofilament, is to get that stretch, keep more fish hooked up, get more fish in the boat. An 8-pound test Trilene XL. XL is going to be a little bit less abrasion resistant than, say, like a XT, but it's going to be a little bit more supple and a little bit more workable. Now, another what's my line for casting little tiny crankbaits, and this is when you absolutely positively have to get every inch out of a cast, is nanofill. It's slickery. It comes off the spool a lot quicker. It goes through the guides a lot quicker. I can take a number 4 flicker shad or a number 3 Salmo Hornet and whip that bait 30 to 50% farther with nanofill just because of how it casts. So, when you really got a strong headwind, if you're casting into it, if you really got to chuck that bait a long ways in clear water and keep the boat off of those fish, then I'm going to revert to a nanofill. and I'm going to fish for those fish in that direction. Fairy wands. Let's talk about fairy wands. And where we got the story idea, Matt Straw and I, for fairy wands and sissy cranks is bass anglers revert to a spinning rod as a fairy wand. Again, it's going back to this macho thing, to where some of your most successful bass anglers on tour in the elite system have actually come from California, Clearwater, really small, thin diameter monofilament or super lines, and they're using spinning rods and whooping up on a lot of the good old boys in the circuit. So, I've always been an advocate of using a spinning rod for a lot of shallow water fishing, and, most walleye anglers would agree. So we're not used to them being called fairy wands. And here's an assortment from a lesser expensive line all the way up to an expensive line of the right rod to use in this situation. Now, you can notice here that just about every one of these rods has got a split grip. That way you can grab the rod in the reel and cast that and use that split grip fulcrum point in order to really chuck that bait out a long ways. The St. Croix Icon 7-foot, medium fast rod, the St. Croix Avid X 7-foot MF, which this rod for a $200 rod is, I think it's actually worth $300-400. And then you jump down here to the creme de la creme, the St. Croix Legend Extreme 7-foot. You notice these are all 7-foot MFs. These are rods that, I can also cast a little bit bigger crankbait if I need to. I can also use them for dual purpose if I got to switch over to pitching a jig up. These, again, are the same rods that I use. I like a longer rod because you can get a farther cast out of it. And you can also manage and handle bigger fish with this system. Now, with the monofilament, you're going to need a longer rod so that you can have a little bit more air, a little bit more play in that longer rod and play that fish and work that fish around. I'm going to use a bigger reel. Normally when I'm vertical jigging or pitching jigs, I'm going to use a smaller reel, but in this situation, I'm going to step up to a size 30 at least. And, from good, better, best, for as far as expensive is concerned, you've got the Abu Garcia Revo S. You've got a Revo SX here for the middle line, and then top of the top is the Revo MGX. This is a situation where I'm going to err a little bit on the fishing rod. Sensitivity isn't so much of an issue. In fact, sometimes it's good to not feel the fish when it bites right away so it can load up on that crankbait. You can, a fish might have to work up on a crankbait regardless of, believe it or not, with two hooks, treble hooks on that. I still feel that sometimes you're better off to be looking away, spacing off, because a lot of times that fish will grab it, and you're going to have to smoke them by both reeling and really jacking that fish hard. But with these reels, I'm going to, systems, sometimes I'm going to err on the side of the rod and have a higher quality rod and a lower quality reel. I think with all the chunking and winding you're going to do here, you're going to need a better reel for this situation, and these are the reels we're going to use. Now, without getting too far ahead of myself, there's ways to trigger these fish with crankbaits. A lot of anglers get stuck into the chunk and wind, and they don't vary their retrieves. Chunk that crankbait out, get it as close to the shoreline as possible. If you've got a sandy beach, sometimes I'll even try to lay it up on the beach and reel it slowly into the water. If you're digging bottom or you're tipping those weeds, lift your rod tip up higher. If you're not ticking bottom every once in a while, sometimes we, with a steep drop-off on a shoreline bite, we'll get down on our knees and put the rod into the water and actually reel with the rod tip 3, 4, 5 feet in the water to get that crankbait down deep. Especially with a smaller bait, sometimes they don't dive as much. You got to get that lure to tick bottom and to stay down in that walleye zone. That's where they're going to be at. I oftentimes will work at a 35 or a 45 degree angle. So as I'm going down the bank, I'm going to actually be casting with the boat positioned here, and I'm going to be actually be casting this way so that I'm covering a little bit more of that shoreline area where those fish are located at. And in turn, as while I'm retrieving that lure, I'll burn it back once, throw it back up there, slowly reel it back again. Very important when you first start that retrieve to slowly reel to get that crankbait to dive. Most people think that the faster that you burn a crankbait back, the faster it's going to get to the bottom, and that's exactly the opposite. Fish the hog trough a lot. Guy taught me years ago, one of the old bass pros said, man, boy, you want to get that lure down to the bottom right away so you can fish the whole tank? Go slow. Think Southern. Pitch that bad boy out there real slow at first to get that crankbait tilting down, and then jerk it, stall it for your retrieves. really interesting years ago in Bull Shoals. I had a great practice, and I'm in my area. I've got it all to myself, and I'm not catching any fish, and I'm actually working a jerkbait back to the boat. And I'm reeling that jerkbait back, and I'm not catching anything. I'm doing the same retrieve I was doing in practice. Well, a cold front had rolled in, and I'm thinking, man, am I going to have to change tactics? Am I going to have to go deep? I'm getting frustrated. Now, I'd taken off my rain suit. It started to get a little bit warmer in the day, and I'm cleaning the floor of the boat, kicking around the rain suit, kind of doing a redneck boat cleaning job, and bang, I get a hit on the crankbait, set the hook on that joker, and I got a 4-pounder in the boat. What was I doing differently? I had reeled halfway back, started kicking the rain suit out of the way, the rod's out of the way, out of frustration. What's happening? I look at my rod tip, I repeat the process, and I'm just sitting there wiggling that rod tip while I'm kicking rain gear around. Well, I don't have to do that every time I cast from this point on. I've realized that maybe something might have happened here. Cast it out, reel it halfway back, and kill the bait. Just let it sit there. Point of the matter is, boom, another 4-pounder that triggered the strike, and that set up what the dabble was for that day. So figure out what they want, jerk it back, reel it fast, reel it slow, give them a bunch of different looks, and in turn it's going to be a deadly process for you. Speaking of a bunch of different looks, you might want to try some jigs instead of cranks. We use a lot of spinner baits. We use a lot of underspin pony heads, like these awesome walleye runners here. Stuff that's going to come through the weeds maybe a little bit better. But, taking those plastics or taking those jig heads, tipping them with plastics. There's a bunch of different shapes here that I love to use for this. Shad style baits when you need just a little bit of action. Going to step it up to a little bit more radical action with the Berkeley Ripple shads. This is the new Pro Series shad over here. And then up top, if you really need a lot of action with some ribs throwing off some sound and a grub tail throwing off some vibration, then the new Power Bait Pro Grub is a great choice, was designed exactly for these specific instances. The cleaner the water, the more subtle action I'm going to use. The dirtier water, the more radical I'm going to get and use that. And you know what? It's really important in these situations when you're working these shorelines to get the freshest data. Navionics Plus right now in Platinum has both the freshest data that I need in the regular mapping that comes preloaded on Navionics Plus. You get the entire United States, Canada. Then with Navionics Plus, you can download the certain bodies of water that you want to fish, and then also get sonar charts involved in that. And sonar charts come from sonar logging. Here's what a lot of maps will look like. They're going to have 5-foot contour. They're not high def. And with the community layer of sonar charts now, by driving around and just recording while we fish the community, and I'm doing a ton of this everywhere I go to improve the maps, our sonar charts is making a map that look like this after picture over there. So, and if you're in a secret spot, you don't want people to see it, you don't have to record. I would encourage you to record everywhere you fish. I do pretty much, but you don't have to. But again, this high def really helps out your fishing and really is going to improve that. Let's move on to Leech Lake. Leech Lake has been a special place for me. It was the birthplace of my first son. Of course, we started to improve the IQ of the state, so Governor Ventura told us you probably ought to move back to Iowa before we lose our federal funding, before you have any more kids. It was a joke, but I never got to fish Leech Lake when I lived there. I was always traveling around fishing tournaments. Now, because a lot of the tours have gone back to Leech Lake, and now AIM's going back to Leech Lake, what an incredible fishery that is. We won the tournament in 2014. We got big fish in 2015. And there's a couple of things that I'm learning on Leech Lake that has really assisted me with my fishing. Now, we can use a lot of these tactics on live bait rigging in a lot of other instances. So we don't have to use these tactics just on Leech Lake. But what I'm going to do, I plan in advance. I've got the web app from Navionics. As you can see here, this is a map that we've actually got Leech Lake. I've zoomed in on it a little bit, but it's not high definite yet until you zoom in even farther. But right up here on the main page of Navionics is web app. And you click on web app, and then all of a sudden, boom, you get all this. Now, it's really important when you're using that web app that you, and I kind of get a little bit ahead of myself here, But you switch over to sonar charts. You're going to get the best detail on a lot of these lakes by looking at the sonar chart layer. And that's a great thing about the web app. It's going to show you. So, if you want to figure out if you want to download an area onto your Navionics Plus, you want to check out the mapping that's available. And of course, we've got more maps than anybody. The web app is a great way to not only study, but also figure out what you want to do. And what's greatest now too about Navionics is you can get updates on one of your old Navionics chips or even a competitor's chip for $99. So bang, all of a sudden you get all of the data that's on maybe a competitor's chip, and then you can also get the rest of the data that you need, or even better data in a lot of instances, for $99 with Navionics Update. Here's the sonar chart little button over here. You can see that I've got that on sonar charts. It's down in the lower left corner. And that's also available on your phone app. It's the exact same way that you turn it on there on your phone app. Now, let's look at what I'm going to be looking for as far as fish location. And when I talk about fish location in advance, on bodies of water, I'm finding out that I'm marking a lot of fish, especially in clear water, in deeper areas where X marks the spot. And what I mean by that is if we go to this piece of water right here, this little saddle, you can see that here's shallow water here, and then you've got a drop off coming down on both ends. Here's the contour line, and look at that X right there. X marked spot. This is going to be an area that I'm going to find one there. I look over here and I found an X marks the spot there. Sorry about that. I've got another X marks the spot here, X marks the spot here. Looking for these saddles and then working them from shallow to deep, back up again, then turning back around and working back down deep and coming back up again. That's a great way to fish these areas. Now, I'm going to locate these and I'm going to try to mark fish first, especially in this deeper water. You can get away with it. If you mark fish, come back to fish the area, and they're gone, then you're going to have to realize that you're just going to have to fish these areas without marking them first. Takes a little bit more time, but again, I'm going to look for X marks the spot, and I'm going to do my due diligence in advance, mark these spots in advance so I can look for them while I'm fishing, and in turn, I'm going to be able to cover that water a lot better. I'm also going to look for corners and cups, looking at other areas of the lake that may not have as much deep structure, may not have as much defined structure. Corners. Here we've got which basically a corner is an underwater point. Or right here's a corner. It's a little bit more subtle of a point. It's an outside bend. Cups are going to be inside bends. So if we look at this right here, we look at this cup right here, looking for corners and cups and then marking some of those. So I've got a cup here and a cup here, got a cup here, maybe some outside bends. Corners and cups are where these fish are going to set up and locate. And then you come over there, you cruise them, you mark a fish, and then you fish them. Now, when I'm talking cruising, I'm cruising sometimes up to 40 miles per hour in order to mark these fish. And I'll tell you, you can really cover a lot of water. 20 is a great speed too. But I found out that going from one spot to the other and cruising 40 miles an hour over rough water, that actually I'll mark a fish and I'll actually store a coordinate on them, go fish where I was going to fish at. And, if I'm running out of options, I can always go back and see what those fish were or try to fish those fish. Now, never good practice to leave fish to find fish, but you mark them and you fish them later. Or I've been running from one spot to another, seeing what I like and marked it, stored a coordinate on it. And I can do that when I'm even past it. I can hit waypoint and then it'll say store at cursor. I've already got my cursor laying over here on the screen. I'll hit store at cursor and then boom, mark a fish, lay a mark on that fish, go back later on and mark that fish. Now, when we're live bait rigging in these instances, once I mark these fish, I'm going to slow down and I'm going to drop the big 3 on them. Now, in an AIM tournament in Minnesota, a little tough to drop the big 3 on them with 2 people in the boat. But if you're recreational fishing, you got 3 people in the boat, have somebody fishing one of the big 3. And what I mean by the big 3 is you've got a leech, you've got a crawler, and you got a minnow. This is a creek chub in this instance here, red-tailed chubs, suckers work. Now, a sucker is not a sucker chub. Sucker's not a minnow. They've actually got their sucker on the bottom of their head right there. But suckers will work as well. The tough thing about fishing with suckers is they like to hide in the rocks and snag up your rig. To where a creek chub's going to be a little harder. It's going to swim around. But anyway, again, I'm going to drop the big three down on them: a leech, a crawler, and a chub, and let the walleyes tell me what they want. What's interesting is we'll go through an area and we'll think that they want leeches, market a couple of fish. They won't bite the leech. Once one of us will throw a crawler on, the other one will throw a chub on, and it's amazing how all of a sudden fish that didn't want to bite a leech want to bite something else and vice versa. So drop it all down there. Now, when I'm fishing with worms, crawlers, a worm blower is a must. You know, especially when you're fishing for big fish, you fish with, you know, say if you've got monster night crawlers, you may not want to inject them with air, but if your crawlers are a little weak, may not have a real defined collar on them, you want to inject them with air. Not only does that make that crawler bigger and more appealing, it also makes it a little bit more alive and a little bit more active, and it gets it up off the bottom. So that once that bait is higher in that water column, then in turn that's going to be a lot more attractive for that fish, and it's going to be profiled a lot more. The fish is going to come up and eat it, make them come get it, and it's interesting how they move so fast and going after it. And worm blowers aren't just for worms. Don't be afraid to throw the needle in there and inject that leech with air. This is one of my secrets now that I'm going to share with you, but put some air in a leech, and it's interesting how that'll lift that leech up higher off the bottom, make it bigger and fatter. Now, if I'm going to inject a crawler with air, I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to take the needle, and I usually stick it and inject it in there right underneath the collar so that it blows air up that way, and it blows air back to the tail. And you want to put that in at a 45-degree angle due to the fact that if you poke it straight in, it might hit flesh on the other side and not fill up that crawler. Stick it in here, though, fill that whole crawler full of air, and boom, you're off and running. Squeeze it and pull out while you're squeezing, and that'll leave all that air in there instead of sucking it back out as you go to pull it back out again. Same thing with a leech. What I'm going to do with the leech is oftentimes I'll get way up here by the head, and I'll go in at a 45-degree angle back this way and inject as much of that leech as possible with air back the opposite way. Hooks. I'm going to insist on using the sharpest hook available. And for years, I've been using Daiichis. I'm non-exclusive on tackle, so I can talk about whatever hook I'm using, whatever bait I'm using, whatever crankbait I'm using. With Daiichi, it was a situation where they saw the mentions in the magazine. They said, hey, man, you believe in it so much, you're talking about it, and you're not sponsored by it. Why don't we do something with you? And that's why I endorse the Awesome Walleye Daiichi hooks. They're the sharpest hook on the market. They're chemically sharpened. Long story short, you got to get a hook into these fish. And sometimes you may not get it all the way up to the barb, but if that point, the farther it sticks in, the better that fish is going to stay on, and the more successful you're going to be. What are we going to use? I'm going to use a number 6 hook most of the time. These first choices are normally what I'm going to use. But if the fish are finicky, or if I feel that that hook may be weighting that bait down, then I'm going to step down to a smaller hook. It's going to float that bait a little bit better. It's going to get it up higher in the water column. And I'm going to use a number 6 or number 8 for leeches. For crawlers, I'm going to use a number 4 or number 6. Good buddy of mine, Ron Hunter from Winnipegashish, told me, you know what, it's all offense. I think he might even use a number 2 hook half the time. But you know, if you're getting a lot of snails on your hooks edges, which happens a lot in Minnesota, or you're weeding up a lot, that again is where that lighter hook can help you get it up off the bottom. An air injected critter is going to get it up off the bottom, and it's going to swim better. And then in turn is when I'm going to use a chub, I'm going to use a number 1 or number 2 hook. You know, red is usually going to be my first choice, but I found that gold works really well, especially in tannin stained water. And another little trick that I'm going to use for these baits, let's say that if I'm using leeches, I want to hook that leech through the sucker, go through the back of the head and out through the sucker. If I'm using a crawler, it's going to be right in the tip of that crawler or right up in the top of it. And then a chub, you go in through the mouth and out right before the snot holes or the snout of that fish, so that that hook is actually in the lip of that chub. It's going to keep it a lot more lively, going to allow it to swim a lot better. Now, if I'm using a jig, I'm going to go through both lips, but if I'm using a chub, I'm going to go just through the lip. And very seldom will I tail hook a chub. I'm most of the time going to hook that chub through the mouth. Another thing I do a lot is I use colored hooks. So I'm going to take that hook that I'm fishing with, and I'm going to take powder paint. I'm going to heat up that hook, and you want to make sure that you coat the bend and the shank of the hook, not the eye and the point barb. Of course, you get paint in that eye, it could break the line, it could cause you problems, it could make it more difficult to tie. And if you get it on the point and the barb, of course, we know what that does to it. So what I'm going to do is from about right here on the shank down, that's going to be the part that I'm going to dip into that paint when that hook is hot, tap it to get off any excess. A little dab will do you. You don't need a lot. And I tell you what, with a myriad of colors to choose from, you find out what the local hot colors are on a body of water and start there first, or go with the ones you think are cool or you have confidence in. But you know, with all these colors available, I'm sure you're going to find something you're going to like. I'm also going to put a little target bead on that. You know, I'm pretty simple. I use the ones Do It doesn't sell a lot of beads. I don't use a lot of different color beads. Salmon orange or milky chartreuse, which this is the salmon orange color here. This is the milky chartreuse here. Those are going to be the beads that I'm going to use pretty much. And you know, I'll tell you what, the smallest beads available usually are the ones going to be the ones I'm going to use. The dirtier water, the bigger the bead, the clearer the water, the smaller the bead. And then as far as sinkers are concerned, I'm going to normally use a 4 to 6 foot leader. And I start out with a leader as long as my wingspan. If I got to cut that live bait hook off because it's down in the fish a little ways, or if I just want to retie, I'll keep retying on the same leader until I'm down to about 3 or 4 foot. If I feel I'm getting fewer bites, then I'm going to go back to a longer leader again. And, you know, we talked earlier about line. When I'm going to be using a leader and a main line in conjunction, I'm always going to use a 2-pound smaller leader than my main line. So on my main line, I'm going to have 8-pound Trilene XL, and on my leader, I'm going to use like 6-pound. Sinkers, I'm going to normally try to stay as vertical as possible. So without going into a lot of detail, 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce sinkers are great for deep water. I might even step up to 1 ounce sinkers. It's going to require a little bit stiffer rod, but you know, you want to stay as vertical as possible, especially in that deep water. Now in shallower water, get the bait farther away from the boat, go 1/4, 1/8 ounce, you know, go to a little bit lighter sinker, but vertical is best in a lot of these situations. And again, what's my line? This is a situation where I'm using monofilament. 8-pound test is my main line, a little bit lighter leader for the leader strength. Now that way, in case you hook up in a snag, you break off the leader and you don't break the main line. But you know, people think, oh geez, you know, on Mille Lacs, I need to use 3 or 4-pound test. I found out that 6-pound test works just fine. Now, if you need it for confidence, switch to a lighter leader. But man, I'm not fishing for smart fish. If smart fish sees my line and swims off, good. I don't need the smart fish. I want the dumb fish. And this is normally what I catch them on is 8-pound test on the main line, 6-pound test for the leader. What kind of rods are we going to use? Here I'm going to go to a more limber rod. Before we talked about casting crankbaits or jigging, I've got a medium fast action. Here's where I'm going to go a little bit longer. I'm going to reach out with a 7/6 rod. I'm going to go to a medium light, which is the ML with an extra fast tip. And if we look at some of these other rods, I've got this one actually mislabeled as an MF, but the Legend Tournament Walleye Series, medium light, extra fast tip, and then stepping all the way up to, you know, they've just redid the Legend Elite Series. Thing I like about this is look at where the blank is exposed right by the reel. You don't any longer have to put your finger all the way out on the rod blank. You can actually keep your finger on both the blank and the line at the same time by only holding onto it with one hand. You know, if you really want the ultimate of rigging rods, this 7/6 is a tremendous rod. Now, if you're going to go jig dragging and rig dragging, I'm not going to get into a lot of that in this seminar, but these are awesome rods for dragging jigs and dragging rigs as well. So for the ultimate and rigging rods, 7/6 MLXF. Here's where I'm going to go, you know, in rigging, I'm going to go a little bit cheaper on the reel and a little bit more expensive on the rod. So we get into this Abu Garcia Cardinal SX. It's just basically meant for line collection. Stepping up again to a Revo SX. Now these are the same size and these are the same reels that we used before, but You know, a lot of times you get a, you know, a really expensive rod. You know, most people want to put a really expensive reel with it. Again, you know, if you want the best of the best, this MGX. If you want something middle of the road, this Revo SX. And if you just want something to pick up the line, that Cardinal SX is a good heavy-duty reel for the money and will get you by. Now let's go into other things to consider here. Mouth tension, very important as far as what is mouth tension. When I'm rigging along and I get a bite, a lot of people think with live bait, you immediately drop the sinker to the bottom. Now you can slowly set it down on the bottom and let the line go. What I'm going to do a lot of times is I'm going to test that fish. I'm going to, first bite I get, I'm going to take that sinker, and I'm just, especially in practice, I'm going to see how long I can get that fish to hold on to that bait. If he lets go of it right away, I've realized that I got a fish that doesn't like mouth tension. In other words, when they grab a hold of a struggling critter, regardless if it's a leech, a crawler, or especially a minnow, they're used to that thing tensing up. They're used to a little bit of wiggling and jiggling. Mouth tension oftentimes will trigger a fish into holding onto the bait longer and sucking it in harder. They'll come up, they'll grab that bait, they'll swim with it. That mouth tension will make them work up on that. So don't be afraid to let the fish feel you. And in turn is judge the bite. If you set the sinker on the bottom, you go to reel down on that fish, 20, 30 seconds later, you give them more time, 60 seconds, and that fish is gone when you reel down on it, you probably need to give that fish a little bit more mouth tension. So you figure out what your count is. You know, sometimes when I'm fishing with a great big leech, I whack them immediately. Crawlers, you seem to have to give them a little bit more time. The bigger the minnow, the more time you got to give them by feeding them more line with the minnow. Fresh line, very important to use fresh line. If I fish rigging with monofilament for a pre-fishing, I'll usually put on new line for the tournament, or I'll at least strip off a bunch of line. Nothing worse than feeding a fish, having it run a long way and running out of line, and you have to stop the process because all the line's gone and you didn't put fresh line on your reel. How and when to set the hook. You know, this all comes back to trial and error, but oftentimes, again, I'll smoke that fish immediately with a leech. I like to start with a 20-second count. If I'm going to drop that sinker on the bottom and let that fish run with that Lindy rig, I'm going to count 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds, and then when to set the hook. Now, if I drop that sinker on the bottom and line starts smoking out of my spinning reel, I'm going to click the bail and set the hook as soon as I can. Now, setting the hook requires reeling down on the fish until you feel the fish and not the sinker. Most anglers will reel down and feel the sinker and set the hook, and that fish may be 8 or 10 or 12 feet from that sinker. You might not have reeled it. You want to reel down, the swivel will slide up to the sinker, and then all of a sudden, then I just keep reeling until that rod loads up and goes zzz, and then that's when I'm going to smoke them. I also have when I get a bite, I switch my reel to back reel. I don't even have to sometimes disengage the spool in order to feed that fish line when I'm back reeling. I can just keep tension on it and back reel. But most importantly, when I go to set the hook, I want that back reel so that I've got the reel and I'm fighting the fish, not the drag. Now, the higher quality the reel, subsequently, usually the higher quality the drag. But again, I want to depend on me and my back reeling skills. If you start hooking onto carp, you start hooking onto sheephead, that's a great time to practice your back reeling. When you're on a smoking hot bite, which right now Leech Lake at opener is going to be probably smoking hot. It's a great time to practice your back reeling because a lot of those fish may be in the protected slot. It doesn't matter if you lose them, you know, you can back reel them. And the last point is fish like a woman. And you know what, guys, I'm not being a sexist or egotistical bigot here. When I say fish like a woman, you fish with a girl, they very seldom lose fish. And the reason being is when they get a fish, they're going to feed that fish a little bit of line. They're going to mess with it. They're going to fuss with it. When they reel down on that fish, they're going to have that rod going like that. They're going to feel the fish when they set the hook. Most importantly, what does a girl do when she gets a fish on? Unlike a man who might baby that fish, follow it around, keep a real small bend in that rod tip. A woman's got that rod bowed over and it's got a good solid bend in it. Guys, we can learn a lot from them. You fish more like a woman, you keep a solid bend on that rod, you keep tension on that hook. Again, that barb may be shy of the skin, but that hook point stuck in the jaw of a walleye's mouth, keeping that rod bent will keep that hook stuck until it gets in the net. And what's interesting is, a lot of the fish that I'm catching right now across the Midwest and the United States, walleyes especially, 60–70% of them are coming off in the net, and I'm juicing them pretty hard. So again, don't be afraid to keep a good bend in that rod and do it that way. Now, I get co-anglers a lot that say I'm not very good at rigging. Another thing that I've been watching Bruce Doc Sampson tear up the trail with, bobbers. If you don't feel that you're very good at rigging, if you're insecure about this, don't be afraid to go to slip floats. You take a Wingate quick swap bobber here. You can put that on your line. You can change quickly with this type of stuff, or you have a couple of different bobber rods set up. You know, we go to Minnesota, it's a one rod state, but we always joke we still have more rods in the boat than we have it at a Wisconsin event where we can have 3 rods in the boat. Slip floats are deadly. I think it's one thing that anglers don't use enough. And when you've got a bunch of rods set up, you can have one set up for the 30-foot depth, have another one set up for the 24-foot depth. Now, I'm just throwing out figures here. Wherever you've been getting those fish to bite on those contour lines or those depths, that's where you're going to want to actually fish with these slip floats and have them set. And still, you know, the clearer the water, the higher from the fish you can have that bait set. So you're not very good at rigging, or you want to try to throw in a little something else at them, stay off of them, throw slip floats to them, and that really works well. Something else that's really been tearing up the trail, and I don't care where you're at in the United States, radical approaches. Corey Schmidt wrote an article in Infishman magazine. He called it bombing. But, you know, I call it radical. And, you know, we're looking at a couple of different styles of bait here. On the left side here, we've got one-eye or hutch hog spoons, hutch one-eye spoons, hutch hog spoons over here. Chunk of lead, it's all offense, got a treble hook on each side, it's got a blade on it. It's incredible holding this lure still or just slightly vertical jigging it. How many fish completely about knock the rod out of my hand when I'm fishing with radical lures? Other side of the page here, there's numerous styles now in the market. This has become one of the hottest trends in walleye fishing, are jigging wraps. And, you know, these are, when I've got a fish that I'm live bait rigging, I prefer to live bait rig these fish. I'll fish through them slow. If they're still sitting down there and sulking, or if they're a couple feet off the bottom, you know, finally, if I'm going to leave, I'm going to give them one last shot. I'm going to get radical, then split. I'm gone. But you know what? What's interesting about this is you drop this bait down, you vertical jig it real mellow. I start subtle and I work my way up radical. Again, right before I go to leave, smoke that bait, rip it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 foot through the water, drop it back down slow, then drop it back down fast, get radical, and then split. I'm either going to drive that fish off of that spot so the next guy can't catch him, or I'm going to make him eat. And that's one thing that getting radical and then splitting does. It's either going to drive him off or it's going to make him eat. Okay, rolling through. We've got a championship coming up on Lake of the Woods. You know, these are also tactics that you can use over on Winnebago system, Green Bay. But this is where the AIM Minnesota Series Championship is going to be at. And it's also going to be a big destination for a lot of people up in Minnesota here this next week. If you're going to go to Green Bay, you can try these tactics there. If you're going somewhere out in the Dakotas, don't be afraid to try these tactics out in the Dakotas too. But, you know, you take a look at this, the saying it's a small world until you got to go to fish a body of water like this. Well, these don't have to be that intimidating. Oftentimes when I'm in big bodies of water, again, I'm going to drive around until I mark fish. And then I'm going to crop duster. And what I mean by that is I'm talking big female walleyes. You mark the big fish out there. Now, these are crappies. This is an entirely different scenario, but it's the photo I've got for this, so it's going to have to do. But if we look at this system, if I'm driving along and all of a sudden I mark 2 or 3 marks like this, and let's say they're up off the bottom on Lake of the Woods, this is going to be a little bit more appropriate looking, this one right by my finger here. I mark that bad boy on one of the coordinates I've been successful, or I mark that fish, go a little bit farther, say a quarter of a mile, mark that fish. I'm going to swing around, and on my plot trail, I'm going to pull back and crop dust those fish. Use this tactic a lot. I think it's the biggest reason I haven't done well at Green Bay is I haven't been using this technique as far as crop dusting fish or crop dusting coordinates. Because we've got a coordinate here, and then half a mile over here, we've got another coordinate. We're going a mile an hour. It's going to take a half an hour to get from this coordinate to this coordinate, and a lot of times there's no man's land in between those two. Crop dust, go through this fish, pick up, go a half mile in the next coordinate, go through this fish, pick up, go another half mile. Again, crop dust in those coordinates really produces a lot of fish. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for the deep pattern. I'm going to look for a depth pattern. Whenever I'm at a boat ramp, whenever I'm at a cleaning station, whenever I'm at a bait store, you run into an angler that just wailed on them. And you know, they don't want to tell you where they caught their fish. They're awfully secretive, and can you blame them? Because most people can't see a distress flag from 2 feet, 20 feet, but they can see a net from 2 miles. Guys are going to keep their spots, keep that pressure down. They're going to be quiet. What they will sometimes tell you, if you're nice and, you know, cordial, say, man, I don't want to know where your spot's at, but I want to know how deep you caught him at. Guy tells me 16 foot. I'm going to take into account that his transducer may not be set, or his electronics may not be set up like mine are. So I'm going to, if he says 16 foot, I'm going to actually fish up to 15 and 14 foot, or I may look out in 17 or 18 foot. You know, I'm going to have about a 4 or 5 foot band to play with there. But again, trying to find out where those fish are at. And if I'm driving along and mark a fish, come back, fish them, go back through, mark, go back and fish them. Now all of a sudden I've realized that if I just start cruising that depth or go someplace else on the lake and fish that depth, oftentimes those fish will be relating to a certain depth. Again, it's crucial. Good mapping leads to success. Having as much and the best mapping possible in order to get through this is going to help you expound upon that deep pattern. And I'm going to reach out to the fish different than a lot of guys are. You get up on Lake of the Woods, they're going to be fishing with bottom bouncers, they're going to be fishing with lead core, they're going to be fishing with dipsy divers, with downriggers. You know, more and more, this is, to me, has been a miracle tool in walleye fishing, is the offshore tadpole. And in fact, they've got the dive curves both on the phone app from Precision Trolling, or you can get these, take a screenshot of it, put it on your cell phone, and have this forever. We actually have all the dive charts for these laminated, or also on the stickers that come from Precision Trolling right on the tackle box that holds them. But you know what? Here's what's cool about this. You take a number 2 tadpole, and I'm going to usually troll from this 1 to 1.5 miles per hour, especially the warmer the water is, the faster I can move. If we're going to look at this dive curve, let's say we're marking fish down at 28 feet and I want to put that bait at eye level or above. I'm going, let's say 1 mile per hour. I come down to 28 foot. I go over here. I'm going to want to put that lure back 45 feet. And that's going to get it down to that depth. Now, let's go to the 30-foot thing here. Let's use that as an example. 30 foot, I'm going to put that down right at about 50 foot. All right. Now, if I'm going to go 1.5 miles, I'm going to have to put out 120. So from wherever we're marking the fish, eye level or above, speed is crucial. So if you're going along and all of a sudden you've got, say, 50 foot of line out, and all of a sudden you start marking fish a little bit higher, you can speed up and pull that bait up to where those fish are at. So let's say you mark those fish at 20 foot, follow the dive curve up, you're going to speed up to 1.5 miles to put that tadpole right at those fish's eyes or above. And that's where these dive curves really help out. Tadpoles for stick baits or spinners. Now, you know, depending on, sometimes I'll pull both. You get a one rod state like Minnesota. You know, it's not too good to get crossed up and pull a stick bait and pull a spinner. I'm either going to pull spinners or I'm going to pull stick baits. Every once in a while, I'll forget that rule of thumb and I'll pull one of each. But, you know, what's great about them is they beat lead core. You don't have to put out all that line when you're pulling a tadpole. They're easier if you want to use boards. With lead core and boards, you're going to have to utilize that segmented lead core. And, with tadpoles, you drop them in the water, they get down fast, they dive. And then when you get a fish on, they release, so you fight the fish and not the weight. So they're going to be a lot easier to use with boards. They're going to be a lot easier than for fighting fish. And you have to determine what do they want. With these tadpoles, it's easy to change from a spinner to a crankbait quickly. Do they want meat or do they want cranks? And not all stick baits are created equal, just like all spinners. Sometimes they want a big blade, other times they want a little blade. With stick baits, sometimes they want something with a really radical action, something with a slashing action, or with a stick bait, they might want something a little bit more subtle. So, put the bait in the water, and if you're catching them on a really radical action, and it's a warm front, if a cold front comes through and knocks that bite down, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to slow down and change up baits to a little bit more subtle action. Same thing's true with spinners. You got a warm front, they want that radical action, that bigger blade. Cold front comes through, you're going to want to switch down to a smaller spinner blade, and sometimes that can be the whole ticket. We see this a lot. You got guys that are out on Lake Erie, Great Lakes, Lake of the Woods. They think that you got to use these great big beads, great big blades. Don't be afraid to go to a smaller bait, and it'll do that. And here's what it looks like. Now I'm going to use the PB&J program. This was the Planer Boards and Jigs article that ran in March, April of this year's In Fisherman that Matt Straw wrote. Here it's got the board, 10-pound test Trilane XT is the monofilament I use when I'm trolling. Here's the tadpole diving weight, and here you've got 10 foot of mono going back. Don't be afraid to go the same pound weight for your lead as you are for your main line. 10-pound back, 5 to 12 feet, put on that stick bait, put on that spinner bait. You can even put on a flicker shad or a flicker minnow or a reef runner. These work great with deep diving crankbaits as well. Can take a bait that normally would only get down 20, 25 foot, and you can take that bad boy down to 30 or 40 foot. So here you've got just basically switch out the jigs and the flies here and put a crankbait on this, and this kind of explains the system. Of course, the more line you put out from the board back to the weight, the farther down that's going to dive. And then in turn is when you get a fish, this releases, goes up to the nose of that tadpole, and you can work around. Again, lures at eye level or above, depth, use precision control. If you're going to, fish out there, and let's say that you're fishing in shallower than 20 foot of water, flicker shads will get down close to 15 foot with 10-4 fire line, 14 foot with mono. Flicker minnows dive a lot deeper. So you get a number 7, a number 9, or maybe even one of the new number 11 flicker minnows. They get down a lot deeper than 20, 25 foot, and that's where it's good to use the precision trolling apps for that. Speed's going to be crucial again if we're using weighted systems, if we're trying to figure out what those fish want. I want to fish these fish fast. If I'm going 1.5 miles per hour, I don't even have to, when crop dusting, I don't even have to put a trolling motor in the water. I can troll with my big engine, with boards. You don't have to worry about the noise. And what I've noticed out on Lake of the Woods, you can actually use your big engine. I'll drop the power pole down in the water with the drift paddle on it to slow me down. That'll control my speed. Find out what that hot window is. The faster you go, the more fish you're going to put your lure in front of. Sooner or later, when that bite starts to taper off, this fastest speed before the bite starts to taper off, that's going to be the speed you're going to want to go. It's usually going to be a 1 to a 0.3 tenths of a mile or 3 tenths of a mile an hour window. So if you're catching them at 1.5, usually 1.4 to 1.6 is that window. Find out what that 3 tenths of a mile an hour window is and stick with it. And, speed up, slow down, lift those baits up, drop them back down again, trigger bites, do S-turns. And sometimes I'll drop my drift paddle down. I'll be going 1.2. I'll lift it up out of the water a little bit. I'll be going 1.5. Sometimes it's just a matter of adjusting that speed paddle. And then once again with these fish, you're marking them out in fairly clear water, or you even marking them in tannin-stained water. Don't be afraid to get radical before you split on a fish. If you're crop dusting, you got 2 or 3 marks in the area, fan cast around the boat, get radical, and then split. And it's amazing how changing from one tactic to another, especially going from subtle to radical, will actually catch those fish. So before we start with question and answers, I just want to encourage you, regardless if you're going to be fishing a tournament or you just want a CRR for fun, get the freshest data and get you some. And this is the Big Fish Thursday. That'll be tomorrow. I hope you catch a big fish tomorrow. I hope you can use some of these tactics. And looking forward to some questions.
Okay, Tommy. The first question actually came from Jason Rhinelander, and he was discussing the tadpole and wanted to know if it was similar to the dipsy diver in how it works.
Yeah, tadpole is going to work very similar to a dipsy diver because when it's you've got the trigger or you've got that tadpole and you've got the snap or the clip all the way at the top of it. It's just like when your dipsy diver is snapped shut and that dipsy diver is diving. And then when you get a fish on the dipsy diver, you pop that line free and then you're reeling that back to the board. The problem with a lot of weighting systems is that they require different line, different rods, different actions. With the tadpole, you can use your same monofilament trolling rods or same monofilament rods. You can even use spinning rods. Because again, when you go to reel in that fish, this doesn't pull that hard to begin with. And when you go to reel in that fish, that clip slides to this position, which is like the dipsy releasing. And then you're fighting the fish and you're not fighting the lure, the weight. So it's going to answer that question in an extolled version. Yes, it's very similar to a dipsy diver as far as the fact that it releases. It just basically releases on the same line that you use with a standard program.
Okay. The next question comes from Jeff. I apologize, Jeff, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. What was the name of the radical spoon with the double blade on the left side? So maybe go back to your radical spoon slide, but it said there was a double blade on the left side, Tommy.
The double hook with the blade on it on this left side over here. There's a number of them on the market. If you're going to buy one in a card, they're called the Hutch hog spoons or Hutch one-eyes. And then in turn is I pour a lot and make a lot of these out of Do-It molds. It's called the Do-It casting spoon. But it's basically you put a little tubing on the hook there that's fluorescent. They've got a little flicker blade. They've got two treble hooks, two split rings on them. They're all offense. And you tie to the fat end because what that does is when you lift it up and then drop it back down again, it falls rear end over tea kettle and it keeps tumbling as it goes back down or it flutters. You jerk them, that'll impart a different action. You lift, drop them, and imparts another more subtle action. And they're phenomenal. It's incredible how a fish will bite something as heavy and as big and as obtruse as these spoons. And, we go to like dirtier bodies of water, tannin-stained bodies of water like Lake of the Woods. The bigger the bait is oftentimes, the more the fish are going to be able to find it.
Okay, Tommy, this one came in this afternoon from Tom, and he was wondering what weight system do you use for trolling floating or shallow diving stick baits?
What weight system do I use for floating or shallow diving stick baits? That's going to be that tadpole system again.
Okay.
Again, you could put a stick bait or a floating bait behind that, and this is going to take it down to the depth you want to. And the biggest thing that's cool about this is that these tadpoles have that dive curve. So at 1 mile an hour, you know how much line to let out. And let's say you're marking these fish at, say, 20 to 30 foot deep. I'm going to put one out 30 foot at 1 mile an hour, which is going to require, again, 50, 55 foot of line. I'm going to put another one out at 28 feet, which is going to require about 40 foot of line, and so on and so forth, to where I can stagger my baits and put those stick baits down to those fish.
Okay. folks, does anybody else have any questions for Tommy? We're running out of the questions. You can type them in on the question and answer period on the bottom there. If we don't get any other questions, we're going to call it an evening here. So when I get any, Tommy, if I get any more, Tommy, I will email them to you, and you can email them directly back to the individual. But I definitely want to thank Tommy Skarlis for his effort tonight. Apologize for the beginning with the little bit of technical difficulty, but we got through it, folks, and I appreciate it very much. And everybody have yourself a wonderful evening. Tommy, thank you very, very much, sir. As always, you've done a wonderful job for our pro staff, and thank you. Kurt Carlson does have one last question, Tommy.
Okay.
Carolina rigs. That was all it was. His Carolina rigs and a question mark.
Well,
as a bass guy, I know what that is. So go ahead, Tommy, as a walleye guy.
Yeah, real quick, too, is if anybody's got I just want to preface this. If we run out of questions, but you think of one later, don't be afraid to go to Navionics' Facebook site and throw that question up and tag me, or go to my Facebook site. You can ask me that there as well. But Carolina rigs, basically, when I was talking earlier about the slip sinker, the egg sinker, and the line sliding through the egg sinker, that's, I guess, the one graphic that I forgot to present. That is a Lindy rig up north, and it's a Carolina rig down south. So you've actually got that sinker sliding on the line, and you've got that leader going back to that live bait. So, I also use a lot of Carolina rigs or Lindy rigs with artificial baits, twitch tail minnows, gulp and power bait minnows. It's a great way to put that artificial bait out there, and when they grab it, they at least can run a little bit and not feel that sinker pulling against them. The line slides through the sinker, and it gives a little bit of give. So don't be afraid to use Carolina rigs. Okay.
And Jim just asked this question, and this might be a good one for this weekend with the Minnesota opener and with the weather that we're going to be facing. Post-spawn, post-cold front, what depth are you starting at, Tommy? Where are you starting to look for those fish?
I'm going to look wherever those fish were at when they were in the warm front. Sometimes we feel the cold front a lot more than the fish do. Other times fish stay in the same depth. It just takes something a little bit different in order to catch them. So, if you're out there and you're going after those fish, and there's a cold front there, change up the way that you fish, but don't let a cold front make you entirely change what you're doing as far as your depth. Find what depth the fish are at, and then fish them accordingly to the fronts.
Okay. And Kurt Carlson is asking 6 foot leaders, question mark, as in, are you normally fishing at 6 foot? Are you fishing longer leaders? What you said arm length earlier, or arm wingspan. What's your leader situation?
6 foot. 6 foot's, the snaggier, the shorter. I very seldom will go past 6 foot. If I feel that the water's really clear, if I feel I got the longer the leader, the more that bait sometimes can swim, the more radius it'll cover. You take a big 6-inch creek chub and you give it an 8-foot leash, he's going to have a 16-foot circle to swim around in. You give him a 4-foot leash, it's going to cut that circle in half, or even less space than that. It's going to make it an 8-foot circle. So, 6 foot's my rule of thumb, my wingspan.
Okay. Mr. Denny Fox, who we both know, would like to know how many tournaments you've won in your career.
I don't know.
Do you?
I think I'm leading the pack with the most majors, but I think at the last count I've got 8 or 9 majors and probably 15 to 20 tournament victories. So as far as AIM is concerned, too, I've won an AIM Pro Walleye Series and an AIM Weekend Walleye Series. So Denny, I can't answer you, as far as your wheelhouse is concerned. Which, by the way, folks, I'm going to tell you what, AIM is batting on all cylinders right now. We've got a bunch of great tournament directors, and Denny Fox is a phenomenal tournament director.
He is. I have not seen him do the tournament thing, but he's definitely a good guy to talk to, and he's good for the industry. Kurt followed up the 6-foot leader with how long a leaders are using with the rig. Kurt, I'm assuming you meant rig on this question. Is it still? He's asking also about the worm harness setup. So are you using a different length of leader with a worm harness rig?
I'm going to usually use a 6-foot leader with a worm harness rig, and I'm going to use the 6-foot leader with a live bait rig. Again, the snaggier the situation, the shorter the clear the water is. Maybe you might want to go a little bit longer, but you can usually get it done in 4 to 6 foot line.
Okay, and then he did throw in here. Are you using? I think this is Kurt's question. Are you using a multi-hook harness system with your crawlers, or are you sticking? You mentioned just hooking it through the nose. Are you using just a one hook system, Tommy, or are you using a multi-hook a traditional worm harness?
If I'm fishing with crawlers and the water's a little bit more stained and it's not important to have that crawler moving around a lot or swimming, or if I'm getting nipped off a lot, I will put a second hook on that crawler. If I'm using a spinner, I'm going to use a second hook on that crawler. Normally you want to space them about 6 inches out. And just realize you can even go 8 inches. They never bite the middle. They either bite the end of the crawler or they bite the head of the crawler. But according to God rest his soul, Chief Papineau, they never bite the middle. They bite one end or the other.
Okay. That looks to be all the questions. Tommy, thank you very, very much for your time this evening. Everybody, thank you for joining us. You can check out this and all of our webinars at navionics.com. On the bottom of the homepage is a link for all of our webinars. I know that most of you tonight are obviously walleye fishermen, but Tommy's actually done a few other webinars, but we've got loads of other species and topics to cover. So navionics.com, check out our webinar, our other webinars. This webinar, if you want to tell your friends, will be up in probably about 3 to 5 business days. And you guys can come back in here and look at Tommy's beautiful mug as much as you want to. So with that, thank you very much, folks. Appreciate your time tonight. Tommy, thank you for your time, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you.